Hello everyone, welcome to version 1.2 of my Resident Evil 2 Remake, hardcore difficulty, Claire 1 scenario, no damage, knife only, S plus walkthrough. I mean, technically this isn't really version 1.2 because I'm playing with audio rather than without audio, but it's pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things, so I'll consider this version 1.2, especially with the improvements I've made to certain strategies with Claire 1. And this will cover the full game in this entire video. So I'm choosing to do Resident Evil 2 Remake after I did my walkthrough of Claire A from Resident Evil 2 OG, because it felt logical to do, and I really felt like it was a good way to show the comparison between Claire A and Claire 1 from both games. And I said in my Claire A walkthrough of Resident Evil 2 OG that I found Resident Evil 2 OG to be pretty overrated, and I had played Claire A, Claire B, and Leon A prior to making that particular walkthrough. Of course, after I did Claire A, I then went on to Leon B, and I do have the footage for Leon B ready. And I'll be honest, guys, Leon B was a lot of fun in Resident Evil 2 OG. There's just something about Leon B that is far more compelling and more engaging compared to the other scenarios of Resident Evil 2 OG. So I will stand by what I said in my Claire A walkthrough, that Resident Evil 2 OG is pretty overrated, and it just doesn't really feel as engaging as Resident Evil 2 Remake. And, you know, this is such a strange conundrum I'm in with Resident Evil 2. You know, I said many times in my Resident Evil 2 Remake walkthroughs that Resident Evil 2 Remake is a very overrated game, it's very boring, it's very dull, but having gone through my Resident Evil 4 Remake retrospective and also having done my walkthrough of Claire A on Resident Evil 2, I've really come to view Resident Evil 2 Remake's gameplay from a very different perspective, and I've enunciated many times before that Resident Evil 2 Remake is a game that is designed for knife only, and knife only is the only way to go. And I was saying that from a very negative connotation, and I will never support knife only as a standard in Resident Evil games. I don't think people realize the amount of sacrifices developers have to make when they design these Resident Evil games for knife only. They sacrifice a lot of complexity, a lot of creativity, a lot of engagement when they design their games for knife only. And there has never been a Resident Evil game where knife only is very engaging, actually feels thoughtful and creative, until I came to Resident Evil 2 Remake and I did this particular walkthrough. And the number of ways I'm able to utilize the new mechanics of Resident Evil 2 Remake to complement knife only and really make knife only feel really fun and actually feel like a baseline experience rather than a really stupid run, it's absolutely incredible. Like, just then, I cut off that zombie's arms to prevent him from opening the door. So that is a great example of me utilizing the mechanics of Resident Evil 2 Remake to my advantage in a very creative way that actually feels thoughtful. And right now we're dealing with G1 Birkin, and it also feels very thoughtful with the way I'm actually using the knife against Birkin. And the knife does really good damage on this game, which makes sense because it has a durability system. And let's be real, guys, the knife in Resident Evil 2 OG had absolutely no reason to exist. It had such gimped damage, and also when you were busy knifing zombies, they had this ability to lunge for your leg and bite you, so it was just dissuading you from even partaking in that mechanic. And you only ever use the knife against dogs and against certain bosses like G2 Birkin and G3 Birkin. Like, the knife had absolutely no reason to exist in Resident Evil 2 OG. But here, they've actually given the knife a reason to exist, and I like the fact that it works the way it does. It has a durability system, and because it has a durability system, the damage has to therefore be good in order to complement that mechanic. What's the whole point of giving a durability system if the knife isn't going to do good damage? They understood that, and furthermore, you can also use the knife as a defense item. I mean, it's really stupid how when you use the knife as a defense item, it doesn't do damage to the enemy, but even still though, the ability to negate grab damage by using the knife as a defense item is a really cool touch. And the way you are able to use the knife in creative ways to complement certain mechanics like stealth, and also when dismembering certain limbs on the zombies, there is a definite baseline experience that doesn't sacrifice creativity and actually makes the experience of going through Resident Evil 2 Remake very engaging. Like, this actually feels like it's designed within the core foundations of the game, rather than being a really stupid run that only morons will want to achieve, or people who just don't appreciate the game for what it is. It really feels like knife only in Resident Evil 2 Remake brings out some of the stronger qualities with its mechanics compared to every other Resident Evil game in existence, but that's just more so a coincidence than anything else, I would say. It's only a coincidence that Resident Evil 2 Remake just happens to be very engaging for knife only. And again, I will never accept knife only only as being a standard in Resident Evil games. Anyone who wants to accept that as a standard for Resident Evil games, they're just fools. But going back to what I mentioned previously about this conundrum with Resident Evil 2, it just really feels like I've had to reevaluate my perspectives on Resident Evil 2 OG and Resident Evil 2 Remake. I mean, on the gameplay side, there hasn't really been much of a change in terms of my views on Resident Evil 2 OG. It's always been a pretty simple experience for me, though Leon B really subverted my expectations. I mean, I don't even know what it was about Leon B that really made me feel more engaged with it. I don't know if it was just due to other external factors or just something about the flow to Leon B just felt very engaging, or the way you were utilizing all your weapons. I really don't know with Leon B, but maybe it was also stuff with the story as well, because the story of Leon B is far more interesting than Leon A, even if there are some pretty interesting moments with the story in Leon A. Like, you know, one thing Wary the Rook forgot to mention about that whole moment where Ada lowers her gun when confronting Leon is that her gun was empty. There were no bullets in the clip whatsoever. Ada was hoping that Leon would simply give up the G-Virus at gunpoint, but he doesn't relent, and he appeals to Ada's good nature, which causes her to actually lower her gun. It's such a great character moment for Ada, and it's just ruined in Resident Evil 2 Remake. Ada has no reason to lower her gun in Resident Evil 2 Remake because she set Leon up to get the G-Virus. If she set Leon up to get the G-Virus, why doesn't she shoot him? It makes no sense. It's like New Capcom forgot about that whole setup moment in the tram where Ada kissed Leon to manipulate him to get the G-Virus for her, and I don't even know why they decided to favor that in the first place. Why would they completely change the character dynamics between Leon and Ada in Resident Evil 2 Remake so that it's more hostile? It's just a complete 180 from how their character dynamics were in Resident Evil 2 OG. It just makes no sense. But I don't know if I prefer the scene where Ada lowers her gun or the scene in Leon B where she saves Leon from Mr. X. Because obviously in that scene, she has the G-Virus, she could just leave, but she goes back to save Leon. So it's meant to convey that same connection. It's just, I do feel like the scene is a bit rushed, or rather the prior events before that moment just don't set up that whole moment where Ada saves Leon. Like just before that whole moment, Annette is confronting Leon, then Mr. X comes in, and then Leon gets past him, and then he goes to the power room, and then Mr. X comes back again, and then Ada comes in. And I just don't feel like there's enough build up to that particular scene to make Ada's death feel more like impactful to me personally. And instead, it just feels so sudden that Ada is knocked out by Mr. X and fakes her death. Whereas I don't feel like that was the same problem with the scene where Ada lowers her gun when confronting Leon, because just before that moment, Leon retrieved the G-Virus from Annette when she was knocked out by those pipes, and the self-destruct sequence was occurring as well, and the music was playing, so you were running, and then all of a sudden Ada stops Leon, and that sets up the scene where she's trying to get Leon to give up the G-Virus since the self-destruct sequence is occurring, and also she doesn't want to shoot Leon. Like, it just feels like the stakes are higher during that whole moment compared to how it's done in Leon B. However, I do feel like the scene where Ada is knocked out by Mr. X makes a lot more sense compared to her just falling down that abyss, because she didn't have the hook shot at the time, so how the hell could she have possibly survived that fall? That's why the whole moment where she's knocked out by Mr. X makes a lot more sense with how she survived compared to how it's done in Leon A, which is why I prefer that scene from Leon B compared to Leon A. And the weird thing is, right around the time Resident Evil Code Veronica X released, there was a supplementary video titled Wesker's Report, where Wesker's detailing the events of Resident Evil 1 and 2, and they included the scene where Ada falls down the abyss. But Wesker's Report was changed. I just don't know if they preserved that scene in Wesker's Report 2. But I know that in Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles and also in Resident Evil The Dark Side Chronicles, Capcom favored the moment where Ada is knocked out by Mr. X as the canon scenario, which makes a lot more sense. And on a side note, Umbrella Chronicles establishes that Ada received the hook shot on October 1st, 1998, while she was recuperating from her injuries she sustained in the fight against Mr. X. So based on that, there is no way the scenario where Ada fell down into the abyss would have made sense because she didn't have the hookshot at the time, like I just explained. But to conclude this tangent, Leon B, story-wise, I would say is a lot more engaging than the other scenarios in Resident Evil 2 OG. But we're now doing Sherry's section, which is a massive waste of time, and it's still just an interactive cutscene moment. The only reason I've included here is to give myself time to go on different tangents. And having mentioned Sherry, can I just say how funny it is that in Resident Evil 2 OG, Sherry talks more like an adult than a child, and then in Resident Evil 2 Remake, it's kind of a middle ground between a child and an adult. Like, Sherry in both cases seems to have a general understanding of what's happening during the events of Raccoon City. And then during Resident Evil 6, when Sherry meets Leon, she says that she was too young to understand what was happening back during the events of Raccoon City. So I don't know which to believe. Like, I don't know if Resident Evil 6 is correct or incorrect regarding that statement, because it is a pretty vague statement. Like, we can't really say that Sherry really understood what was happening during the events of Raccoon City, given that the voice acting in Resident Evil 2 OG, it made it come across like Sherry was talking more like an adult than a child, just based on the way her lines are written. And then in Resident Evil 2 Remake, it's like a middle ground between a child and an adult, like I already mentioned. So I feel like Resident Evil 2 Remake Sherry might complement the quote in Resident Evil 6 where she says she was too young to understand what was happening back then, like, at least on a deeper level. Like, she was too young to understand on a deeper level what was happening back during the events of Raccoon City. Whereas Resident Evil 2 OG Sherry might not complement that particular quote from Resident Evil 6 just based on the way she was written. But I'm probably making an irrelevant connection, and Resident Evil 6's quote might relate to something else, actually. But I just thought I'd point that out. But talking about other characters, I want to talk a bit about Chief Irons. I find it really strange how in Resident Evil 2 OG, upon meeting Claire for the first time, he doesn't try to kill her because he says he was going to kill everyone, because he was practically insane at that point. Because Umbrella practically destroyed Raccoon City and he was accepting a lot of bribes from them, he was practically a pawn in their little game, and so he lost his mind, and so that's why he was trying to kill everyone in the RPD. But why doesn't he kill Claire? That's something I never understood. And also, I find it really silly how in Claire A, he gets infected with the G virus because Birkin comes in and implants him with an embryo, and yet he's still talking like normal when he meets Claire again in this little dungeon area, and it's the same dialogue you hear in Claire B. So I find that really odd that that's the case. It's also really odd how in Claire A and Claire B, Claire is able to read that email sent from the FBI to Chris Redfield regarding the charges against Brian Irons and how he was accused of raping someone, and I think he was accused of raping multiple girls, but the charges were dropped against him. Yet she doesn't really say anything when she first meets Brian Irons in his office. Based on these factors, I can definitely understand why the initial interaction between Claire and Irons had to be hostile in Resident Evil 2 Remake. It's just I can't understand why Irons wants Sherry's pendant. Why does he need the pendant to gain access to the G virus? Why does he want to waste time going through the sewer area, which is practically crowded with BOWs, in order to get to the tram that will then take him to the Nest facility, to then allow him to get the G virus? Like, the game never elaborates on Irons' motivations. Why does he want to do this when Raccoon City is practically doomed? And just the way he tries to get the pendant, why does he not try to kill Claire? Why does he instead tie her up? Why does he try to take Sherry? Why does he not try to check and make sure that Sherry has the pendant? Like, it just doesn't make any sense the way Irons goes about trying to get the pendant. So both versions of Irons have flaws, but Resident Evil 2 OG's version of Irons is definitely better than Resident Evil 2 Remake's version of Irons. Ooh, and speaking of comparisons, we have the sewer area. It's honestly crazy how little you spend in the sewer area in Resident Evil 2 OG, and there's not even any enemies, there's barely any rooms. Like, that's a great example of where it feels like development of Resident Evil 2 OG was hindered in certain areas, because you really notice the lacking quality of the sewers area and also the laboratory area in Resident Evil 2 OG. But Resident Evil 2 Remake fixes this, and they give a lot more to the sewers area and the laboratory area. You're doing so much more. The environments look pretty cool. I mean, a lot of people criticize the way the lab looks in Resident Evil 2 Remake, saying that it's far too futuristic and clean, whereas in Resident Evil 2 OG, the lab was a lot more mechanical and clunky. Personally, I don't really have a preference for the lab designs. I just think the reason why people like the mechanical and clunky nature to the lab in Resident Evil 2 OG is because they like the steampunk vibe of it, and also because they're of the belief that Birkin's lab is in the sewers just below Raccoon City, so it's reflective of the idea that Umbrella is working with the space provided to construct the lab, which is why it looks mechanical and clunky, and people are appreciating the story reason behind that. But that's not actually true, because Birkin's lab is not in the sewers, it's in the industrial zone on the outskirts of Raccoon City. So I imagine the space provided to Umbrella wouldn't be as restrictive as it would be designing the lab in the sewers, which is why I don't have a preference over the lab designs. I mean, it can be mechanical and clunky, it can be futuristic and clean. It really doesn't matter. I just like the fact that they put in a lot more into what you're doing in the lab compared to Resident Evil 2 OG. Well, so that first G-Adult, I first trigger it, and then I try to bait out an attack, then run past it, and then I hide behind the mound of flesh and just walk so that the second G-Adult isn't aware of me. And then as soon as I see an opening, that's when I get past it. So that is another example of where you can use stealth to your advantage to get past these G-Adults. And then right here, for some weird reason, this G-Adult isn't trying to despawn, so I need to stun it by hitting its head, because I just cannot hit the eyeball on its shoulder. So I'm going to get past it right here and then run, and then there's going to be another G-Adult that spawns, so go backwards, wait for it to attack, and then it will not stun you as it's rising out of the water, and you'll be able to get past it easily. And then this part right here, walk so that the zombie on your left doesn't hear you. And then we're going to be able to deal with G2 Birkin right over here after we solve this minor puzzle. And G2 Birkin on Resident Evil 2 Remake is so much better than how he is in Resident Evil 2 OG. Because all you did with G2 Birkin in the original Resident Evil 2 was back up, bait out one single slash, and then knife his leg during the recovery frames. And because of the fact that you had these fixed camera angles getting in the way and they would pause the game at times, it could mess with your inputs and was really frustrating. But here, they've at least made the act of dealing with him without any weapons really engaging, because it involves cleverly positioning yourself and taking advantage of his movement in order to set him up to be hit by the crane. And I know I said in one of my playthroughs of Resident Evil 2 Remake that when I was doing this, it just felt very awkward, and I don't know why I thought this was ever like well designed or anything, but I'm kind of on the middle ground there. There's a part of me that says it's pretty awkward. There's another part of me that says it's really fun. So I'm just kind of in the middle with that. I mean, all I'll say is it's definitely better than how it is in Resident Evil 2 OG. I mean, you might think, oh, just shoot him with, like, incendiary grenades, or just shoot him with, like, the Magnum in Resident Evil 2 OG, but, I don't know, it doesn't really feel like the game wants you to use the guns against G2 Birkin with the way he's designed. Whereas here, it's just clear they want you to be very clever with how you deal with him. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a wide angle around G2 Birkin, but also make sure that I'm not directly behind him to prevent him from quick turning. So I need to see my opening to get near the button once the crane is ready, and as soon as I press the button while he's in the recovery frames of an attack, he will always roar and do a charge attack, and the charge attack is really fair because you can always run right past him. That's the way they designed that particular move. And then when the crane hits him, you need to get behind him, get him to do a back attack, and then try to move exactly like how I'm moving and staying on his blind spot so that he doesn't quick turn, but you can also make sure you're just looping him around to give the crane time to recharge. So the crane is ready, but I need to get him away, which I'm going to do by baiting out an attack. And right here, he does the jump attack. When he stuns you with the jump attack, it doesn't actually damage you, which is well designed. And right here, he's doing the grab, so this is my opportunity. I'm going to hit the button, but because I'm close to him and because he finished his recovery frames, he's not going to do the charge attack, so I need to bait out a different attack. In this case, it was the 3-hit combo, which is well designed, and now he's going to get hit by the crane, and we're on the last phase. So once again, hit the button, get behind him, bait out the back attack, and because we're on the last phase, he's going to move a lot faster rather than having to build up towards moving faster. So once again, stay on his blind spot and loop him until the crane is ready. And the last phase is dangerous because he has access to a 5-hit combo, and he covers a lot of range with that 5-hit combo. So placing yourself in the arena correctly in the event that he does that 5-hit combo is very important, but luckily for me, he did the 3-hit combo. But I don't want him doing an attack right there. I want him to do an attack next to the button, so that when I hit the button, I can set myself up in a position where I can lure him into the path of the crane when he does the charge attack. Right now, he's doing the jump attack, and the jump attack is fine, but he doesn't really stay in the recovery frames for long. So if you're going to hit the button when he does the jump attack, you have to make sure you're right next to the button when he does that move. So I've hit the button, he did an attack, which means his next attack is always going to be the charge attack, so I'm going to run past him, and he will not have enough time to get away from the crane, and he's down. And we're now at the lab, which definitely got the expansion needed to make it more substantial as an area, because in Resident Evil 2 OG, you barely spent any time in the lab. A scenario, you spend even less time in the lab, whereas in the B scenario, you spend even longer in the lab and can even go to additional areas in the lab, but it still was very short. And also, Ether pointed this out to me, but he found it very strange that Leon and Claire just casually go to the lab without any sort of prior knowledge that it's even there. Like, what's their motivation for going there exactly? And I 100% agree with him. It really doesn't make any sense. I'm surprised that didn't occur to me sooner, but you just kind of brush off those moments in these fixed camera Resident Evil games. Like, there are also radio conversations that Leon and Claire get into, and they just say things in passing, like the other character knows about these specific areas. Like, when Claire is saying, oh, I cleared the wreckage away from that one hallway, like, how does Leon know what wreckage she's talking about when she doesn't even know the route he went on? It's one of the stranger parts to Resident Evil 2 OG's writing, but writing back in the 90s era was just really weird for gaming, and I really don't understand why it was so weird for games back then. And speaking of weird, I want to talk about the zapping system in Resident Evil 2 OG, which is the whole system where your actions in the A scenario affect the B scenario, but those actions are entirely negligible because the actions in the A scenario that affect the B scenario are based around optional stuff. Like, for instance, in the A scenario, you can go to this room in the basement of the RPD that allows you access to a submachine gun and the side pack, and you can only select one. And then if you select one, the B scenario character cannot get that item. They can only get the other item. So if you take the submachine gun, the B scenario character is only able to gain access to the side pack, which is additional inventory space. But there really isn't a need for any character to get the items in there because of the way Resident Evil 2 OG is designed. And I'm glad that you're not being forced down side routes in order to get important stuff, because it would have really messed with the pacing of the scenarios. And there's this other thing in the A scenario where you get this cord from an interrogation room, and you can use it on 1 out of 2 power boxes related to the metal shutters that block the barricades. And when you use it and you get to a certain story moment that takes you back to the library, you get this little cutscene where zombies start coming through the barricades. So if you didn't use the cord, the zombies come from both barricades, but if you use the cord, they only come from one set. And if you use the cord in the A scenario and you go to the B scenario, I believe how it works is once you get inside of the library at any point in the game, the metal shutters will disengage and the zombies will start to come through. I don't know if the other set of zombies is affected. Like, I'm not entirely sure how it works, but regardless, it's entirely negligible. It doesn't matter if you use the cord or not. You can delay the spawning of those zombies by just getting to the library at the correct point in the B scenario, where you're not having to go through those corridors where the barricades are in order to get important loot. So when you get the important loot by going through those corridors and then you go into the library, you won't ever have to deal with those zombies. So it just seems like this whole idea of the cord is there for people who aren't good at the game or for the more casual players. But if you understand Resident Evil 2 OG beforehand, you can completely negate the need to go for the cord. So I feel like that's probably intentional the way they designed that, but I mean, I don't really see how it's stressing upon the idea of the zapping system or like the sense of community or anything like that. Like, the cord is just a completely superfluous mechanic, and in my playthrough of Leon B, when I got the diamond key from Sherry, there was never a need for me to go to the library because I was supposed to go backwards and use the diamond key to gain access to the evidence locker to then gain access to the space where Marvin is. So, I mean, logically, there's no reason for you to even go to the library because you have to take the path that's correct. Obviously. It just feels like the cord and this whole mechanic of zombies coming through the barricades, they're just there to punish people who are bad at the game or just playing the game incorrectly. It's like in Resident Evil 0, where as you're going through areas, enemies can at times repopulate areas you've already visited once you got to certain story moments. Like, you get rooms repopulated with hunters or eliminators. But the only way you're ever going to encounter these enemies is if you're playing the game incorrectly, or you're choosing to go on the wrong path for no reason, or you haven't memorized the layout of the maps correctly. There's literally no other reason for this particular mechanic to exist in Resident Evil 0, and it's really feeling like the same case in Resident Evil 2 OG, where these mechanics only exist to make you go down one specific path, and they're only there to target the minority of gamers that are really bad at these games. So that's the second instance of the zapping system, and the third instance, which I believe is the final instance of the zapping system being noticeable, although I could be wrong, is in the A scenario in the lab. You can activate this P epsilon gas, and doing so will remove some enemies in every room and also weaken any enemies that aren't removed. But if you release the gas in the A scenario, certain enemies in the B scenario will become stronger. So all IVs will transform into poison IVs, and all liquors will become enhanced liquors. But why on earth would you ever be put into a situation where you'll need to activate the P epsilon gas in the A scenario? It doesn't make any sense. You get through the lab so quickly in the A scenario that there is no need to activate the gas. And the IVs, There's only like 3 Ivies in the entire A scenario, and the Lickers already die very fast from your guns because that actually makes a lot of sense. So on what planet would you ever find the need to activate the P Epsilon gas in the lab? That just makes no sense. So I see it's just another superfluous mechanic, or maybe the P Epsilon gas is for getting like additional equipment that's completely unnecessary if you've been playing the game right. Like, I just feel like it's yet another mechanic that, just like the cord mechanic, is just there for the sake of it, and it's just there to benefit the minority of gamers that aren't really that good at Resident Evil 2. It just really doesn't make any sense to me why these kinds of mechanics are in the game. It relates back to a point I mentioned in my Claire A walkthrough, where it just feels like the older Resident Evil games are there to set a baseline for mechanics that would be later improved upon in later Resident Evil games. Like this whole zapping system, this is similar to the zapping system in Resident Evil Revelations 2, where your actions in Claire's campaign, because it's 6 months before Barry's campaign, affect his campaign, and it's implemented much better than in Resident Evil 2 OG. It just feels like they set up the prototype for the zapping system, and they released the game the way it was just to give the developers an incentive to improve upon the system in later Resident Evil titles whenever they felt like implementing the mechanic. That's literally the only thing I can think of with why the zapping system is the way it is. And the zapping system feels about as pointless as the live selection system in Resident Evil 3 OG, because there were certain choices that you could make in Resident Evil 3 OG that just made no logical sense. Like with those crates coming at you, and you have the option to either climb up or fall down a hole, but why would you ever want to fall down the hole? Or like in the restaurant encounter, where you have the option to blow up the gas or go down into the basement. You don't even have to do any of those options. You can just avoid the live selection altogether, and it's a better option because you don't spawn later enemies, and you can easily avoid Nemesis's strike attack and just get past him. That's literally what all the no damage and speedrun players do when it comes to that particular live selection, and the only reason people select certain options is just to see these additional cutscenes that may or may not be canon. Like what happens with Murphy, for instance, and I didn't even know Murphy was a character in Resident Evil 3 OG until somebody in a YouTube comment mentioned that to me in my Resident Evil 3 Remake playthrough. I thought Murphy only existed in Resident Evil 3 Remake, but it turns out he was Carlos's friend, and there's an option to actually see Carlos kill him, or Nikolai kills him, but that's just not a good enough incentive to partake in those kind of choices. And I know a lot of people praise that whole moment where Carlos kills Murphy because it adds more to his character, but regardless of whether you see that cutscene or not, Carlos is still the same character. You can still glean a lot of Carlos's personality with or without these particular cutscenes, so that's not really like an interesting incentive to partake in the live selections. You're only ever going to pick the live selections that contribute to an optimized route, allow you to avoid bad enemies, or just access puzzles faster. Like near the end of the game, you have the option to either push Nemesis off the bridge or just fall off the bridge yourself, and if you fall off the bridge yourself, you can gain access to the water sample puzzle very quickly, rather than pushing Nemesis off the bridge and then taking an even longer path to get to the water sample puzzle. It's like, where's the incentive to push him off the bridge at that point? And all these additional cutscenes tied to these optional choices, I question if the reason why they put those in is just because, oh, people didn't have the ability to capture gameplay back then, and so because of the fact that you couldn't capture gameplay back then, these moments with the additional cutscenes were more valuable or something. But that'd be really silly if that was one of the main reasons why they locked those kind of cutscenes behind optional live selections, and you had to go through multiple playthroughs of Resident Evil 3 OG to see those additional cutscenes. And Resident Evil 3 OG released during a time where most games were very mindless experiences and were easily stereotyped as being products designed for delinquents. Or you have the stereotype where someone's staring at a screen and they're looking at white noise and they're drooling and they have red eyes, and that type of stereotype was heavily predominant during that generation. And if that was the case, I don't imagine anyone from that generation would invest additional time trying to get story cutscenes. They would just want to invest additional time because they want to have fun with the game. So I don't imagine that was one of the main reasons why they wanted to favor the live selection system in Resident Evil 3 OG and then lock certain cutscenes behind certain choices you have to make, because of of the generation that Resident Evil 3 OG released in. Like, I'm not entirely sure what the official reason for the live selection system is in Resident Evil 3 OG. I think Ioma-san briefly discussed it when Carcinogen SDA was interviewing him back in 2018. But I believe the live selection was simply them wanting to do something different because of the fact that Resident Evil 3 OG wasn't originally supposed to be Resident Evil 3. It was supposed to be a Gaiden experience, and because it was supposed to be a Gaiden/side story, they thought of doing different mechanics, and the live selection was one of them. And also, Resident Evil 3 OG was a relatively short game, and Ioma-san wanted to add more length to it by favoring the live selection system. I think that's what he said. I'd have to rewatch the video again. But regardless, it just feels like a lot of this stuff, like with the zapping system from Resident Evil 2 OG, and also with like the live selection system from Resident Evil 3 OG, they just felt like prototypes for mechanics that would be introduced into games later on. Like, they were just there to give incentive for the developers to actually invest in these ideas when possible. That's really all I have to say about that, and I know I just spent a large portion of this video not talking about what was happening, because I talked over G3 Birkin, I talked over G4 Birkin, but you already know how to deal with these guys if you watch my previous walkthroughs, and it's pretty easy to tell exactly how I'm dealing with them. But yeah, there is definitely a lot to talk about with regards to Resident Evil 2 OG and Resident Evil 2 Remake, as well as with other Raccoon City-based Resident Evil titles like Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 3, and potentially Resident Evil Outbreak. Like I said, this retrospective I have planned for Resident Evil 2 Remake is definitely going to be a bigger challenge than my Resident Evil 4 Remake retrospective. I really thought it was going to be a breeze, but when I'm factoring in a lot of the good and bad qualities from both Resident Evil 2 OG and Resident Evil 2 Remake, and also a lot of the stuff related to the lore and characters and story moments, it's quite extensive, let me tell you. I mean, it's definitely going to be shorter than my Resident Evil 4 Remake retrospective, but it's going to be longer than I was expecting, honestly. But at least with the help of certain subscribers like Uncanny Hector, who has been a big help in actually clarifying a lot of things related to Resident Evil 2 OG. He's even referenced certain guidebooks for me to look at when I'm doing my research into Resident Evil 2 OG, as well as my own ability to record Resident Evil 2 OG and really get the gameplay that I'm expecting to show in my Resident Evil 2 Remake retrospective. I will definitely be able to cover a lot of stuff related to Resident Evil 2 OG and Resident Evil 2 Remake for sure in the upcoming retrospective. But this is the end of version 1.2 of my Claire 1 walkthrough of Resident Evil 2 Remake. Stay tuned for the upcoming walkthroughs and stay tuned for a lot more discussion on the older Resident Evil games. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.